Good evening, everyone, and welcome on behalf of Michael Anderson and I from the Create Centre on this, in Sydney anyway, a very cold, wintry kind of evening. We're in for a really interesting webinar tonight, the drama of these times. But before we start, we're going to acknowledge our First Nations Australians. The University of Sydney is on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, but I'm joining from Darug country. And you might like to acknowledge the country that you're joining from in the chat. We'd like to pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and thank them for their care of this wonderful land. At the same time, we acknowledge that that land was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And we thank our First Nations colleagues for their care, ongoing care of the land on which we all live, work, and have pleasure. I'm assuming that those of you joining know something about the Create Centre, creativity in research, engaging the arts, transforming health and well-being and education. If you don't know very much about it or you'd like to join, I'm sure Anna will put the link in the chat, and we'd love to have you become a member and receive our e-newsletter, which gives you lots of information about all of the different things that we do. Now it's my pleasure to hand over to co-director, Professor Michael Anderson. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Robin, and welcome everyone tonight, to an event which promises to be kind of a highlight of winter in Sydney. We're really pleased to be able to invite Kelly and Michael to speak tonight. Now, Kelly is an associate professor at the Sydney School of Education and Social Work, of course, at the University of Sydney. She's also a foundation member of Create. Her research focuses on drama, social justice, creativity in education, and school-community relationships. Her teaching interests include drama pedagogy and teacher education. Michael Finneran is the Gilbert Fellow from the Shark Centre. And Shark, for those of you who don't know, is the Sydney Social Sciences Humanities Advanced Research Centre, which sits at the University of Sydney. And Michael has the rare distinction of getting money out of the University of Sydney to travel and not even being a member of the University of Sydney. So well done, Michael. Not at all jealous. So Michael's head of drama and theatre studies at Mary Immaculate College, University of Limerick Island, where he leads the BA and doctoral programs in applied theatre. His research focuses on drama, theatre practice, creativity and social justice. And I mean, apart from those kind of formal introductions, these are two of our most cherished colleagues in the Create Centre. They're both wonderful human beings committed to their area and the growth of the field. And I'm really delighted that they're able to be here tonight to really bring to life this fascinating topic. So welcome, Michael. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
everyone.
Lovely to see you here, and I'm sure there'll be others joining on YouTube later on. So hello to them as well. I'm going to kick off a little bit, and thank you, Anna, for all the facilitation, and Robin and Michael for those warm welcomes. Díomh fád agus privilege almost a ben show live Anocht. And as Michael said, I'm Michael Finneran. I'm head of drama and theatre studies at the University of Limerick, and it's my privilege, and I'm very honoured to be a visiting Gilbert Fellow at Shark at the moment, and to be able to hang out and drink some good coffee in Sydney. I disagree that it's as cold as everyone else is making out. I find it to be very mild, to be honest, at this moment in time, but I know that we'll all probably disagree about that. I too just want to take a moment to acknowledge that I am on Gadigal land in the Eora Nation, and I'm very privileged to be visiting this land. I want to acknowledge I acknowledge that this land has never been ceded, and I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emergent. And I also want to acknowledge Irish complicity in terms of this land being stripped from its traditional owners, and that's a history that should not be forgotten. I'm going to share our slides and get things off to a little bit of a start, if I may. Here we go. Okay, yes, it's working. So the drama of these times. This really, I suppose, is a conversation, and probably the culmination, or maybe a pausing point in a conversation that has been going on for probably a decade, I think, at this stage. Kelly and I just were discussing this over coffee yesterday. She maintains that it started in a hotel room in Auckland, which is not as dodgy as it sounds. A number of us had retired I think Penny Bundy might have been with us. I see her in the attendance list. We retired for a glass of wine when there was no other options perhaps available after a long conference day, and there was a long and heated discussion about the relevance really of the work that we do as drama educators, as theatre practitioners, as applied theatre practitioners for the world that we're in. So I suppose our ongoing conversation is based around a conviction that drama has a unique potency and a unique relevance in the world, and a desire to really celebrate the good work that takes place globally, in studios, in classrooms, in streets, in hospitals, in prisons, and in the multiplicity of places in which we now find drama theatre performance that is perhaps socially minded. But inherent in our conversation then and now is an implicit acknowledgement that the world is changing and that the world is becoming increasingly unequal and increasingly challenging. We're all very aware of the kind of rise that we've witnessed over the last decade, a new perhaps global order in politics. And as a result, there's a profound sense of turbulence, a profound sense of that the world is in the midst of significant and perhaps rapid change. We've had Brexit, we've had the rise, fall, shall we see indeed the return of Trump. We've had ISIS, we've had global conflicts. Putin's murderous invasion of Ukraine and slaughter of innocents has really caught our consciousness over the last period of time. We've seen a democratic crisis in Turkey and Brazil. We've seen the climate emergency reach a point at which it simply cannot be ignored, even by perhaps climate deniers at this stage. And during the last 6 months of this project, I suppose, and I'll show you the outcome of it in a few moments, we were writing against a backdrop which was vivid, to say the words, and I know I'm speaking also of a big festival on in Sydney at the moment, but there was massive bushfires raging through Australia, and obviously we were all locked down in the middle of a global pandemic, resulting in what has been an utterly profound moment and change of life for us. Black Lives Matter has become, a mantra that cannot be ignored in any way, shape, or form, and should not be dismissed. Me Too, to speak of just two of the hashtag movements that have emerged over the last number of years. So our conversation about the drama of these times really is wherein lies the relevance of drama as an educational, a cultural, a social force in these times, and what kind of role does drama hold as hopefully a force for change and a force for good in a world that moves as fast as the one we're in. So we Kelly and I did as academics do, and we set to work and we tried to chart all of this in a book, which emerged again splendidly right in the middle of isolation. I don't think we've even properly raised it last week yet, Kel, so we'll have to do that soon. And this was published last year, Critical Themes in Drama, Social, Cultural and Political Analysis. Those of you who have published or engaged with publishers will know the battle that we fought and lost, which is that we wanted to call the book The Drama of These Times, but Routledge and their editorial team, obviously, they want searchable terms and keyword terms and so on and so forth. So that was a battle that we lost. The idea of these times really is perhaps one that we borrowed. A previous work that Kelly and I undertook was a co-edited volume which came out in 2016 called Drama and Social Justice. And a wonderful colleague of ours, who's a distinguished professor at the University of Toronto, Kathleen Gallagher, wrote in that book about our times And she wrote in particular about the, about the importance of paying attention to rising inequality, the rise of neo-capital interest in foreclosing the possibility of social justice, to quote directly from her. And she made us distinctly uncomfortable at that time by questioning whether, and again, quoting directly from Gallagher, in the face of mounting evidence of growing global inequality, a theory of drama and justice is possible. So, I suppose we took this as our challenge, and we set this down as a challenge to which we might attempt to rise. And we set out to try and contribute something towards a justice-informed theoretical understanding of drama in these times. These times, how we've come to understand them, well, we drew on the work of an anthropologist, Arjun Appandurai, as a way in which to map these times, because of course different people and different sociocultural thinkers have tried to engage with with the phenomena that are unfolding before us right at this very time in myriad ways. But we particularly liked Appandurai's work, and he describes a series of global flows which create disjunctures between economy, culture, and politics. So you see them there in front of you. You've got the ethnoscapes, the movement of people, the mediascapes, the technoscapes, which I'll return to later on, the financescapes, and the ideoscapes. And these are not separate or standalone in any way, shape, or form. These are very much interlocking phenomena, each of which are codependent upon each other. So using this as one of our kind of core templates, we wanted to provide, and we sought to provide, new perspectives on how drama functions within a fast-paced, overlapping and disjunctures of global flows and their influence on the politics of global culture. One of the interesting things about doing any research in drama and theatre, and particularly within our bespoke tradition of perhaps drama education and applied theatre, applied drama, whatever you choose to call it yourself, is that every work, and I'm sure many of you on the call will smile at this, everyone almost has to set out to define what they mean by drama. We all see it differently. And I suppose in the work we simply use the word drama. We willingly and knowingly incorporate and appropriate a huge spectrum of theatrical and dramatic activity, from main stage theatrical work to applied theatre practice, classroom drama, street theatre, drama therapy, theatre for development, community theatre, performance art, and the myriad other variants and emergent practices that are out there in the world. But I suppose these are the fundamental tenets, really, of how we understand drama and our particular orientation towards drama. We see drama right in the midst of a very profound social turn in arts practice in general. But these characteristics, I think, are ones that stand out for us, and particularly perhaps the last three are very important. That it has a change orientation. It seeks to bring about pro-social orientation, perhaps seeks to bring about a somewhat better world than that in which it began, and aspires to being agentive, that it seeks to make participants powerful in some way, shape, or form, in order that they can bring about change in their own lives, that have a Habermasian notion of self-emancipation, and that it's hopeful, that it's not all, because if one is to be pessimistic about the world, then all is lost. So in the book, we explore how drama intersects with a series of key socio-political and cultural events, and we try to map out how this rethinking is happening. And I suppose the last thing I'll say before handing over to Kelly is that we embrace complexity to some degree, to a degree that perhaps we can, I don't know, over-complexify perhaps things at times as well. But we deliberately eschewed the idea of simplifying and finding any kind of comfort in simple answers. And we aimed instead for multiplicity and complexity in the ideas. That's not suggesting this is, that this is a massively important intellectual work. I don't mean to overblow it in any way, shape, or form, but I'm trying to give you a sense of our approach to the work, which is that we deliberately sought out complexity and intersectionality in the hope that in the gaps and in the silences, we might find some insight and some exploration of the themes. So I'll pass over to you at this stage, Kel, because I think that's the end of my stage.
Okay, thank you. It's actually a good point to pass over, because one of the things that I was going to pick up on is this idea of the relationship between the simple and the complex. And, you know, with the idea that the provocation for this particular work was Kathleen Gallagher's point that is it even possible in these times, or in our times, as she termed it, to think of a theory of drama and social justice, to conceptualize one. Theory was at the forefront of our mind, but the way that we attacked that and the way that we tried to bring in the intersectionality, because it's such a huge, messy, complex, dynamic space that we're talking about, was to think about frameworks that would give us a way in. And it's something that I think, you know, working in teacher education and drama education, this is one of the things that I've been thinking about recently, is the importance of frameworks, theoretical frameworks about what we do, particularly because our work is so in the moment in lots of ways. It's in the body, it's in time, it's in space, it happens instantly. It's your reaction to this particular participant who says this, or this piece of work that's doing this in time. It's what frameworks, theoretical frameworks do, is give us an opportunity to kind of step back and look at our actions within something bigger, and you know, see those moments and those actions as building towards something or not, potentially. So in some ways, what they managed to do is both simplify and complicate, right? They kind of give us a streamlined way of talking about complex things. So when it comes to ideas about social justice or justice or social change, which, you know, were all themes that we were looking to try and understand how a theoretical framing of drama in these times for this purpose might work, there are lots of different kind of theories that consider justice and social justice and what it is and how it's enacted and why it matters. We love Nancy Fraser's work. And so it was where we kind of went to first. And one of the reasons why I love Nancy Fraser's work is because I think it speaks really nicely to some of the things that drama does. I mean, I think that there's a lot of connection there. So, I mean, at the core of her work is the parity of participation, right? The idea that for a society to be just, then members of the society should be able to participate in it, okay? It's such a simple idea, but it's so complicated at the same time. So according to Fraser, that for that to work, for people to be able to participate equally in society, you need three things. You need to consider the distribution of resources, right? So they need to be able to, there needs to be a distribution of wealth and resources, access to services that is equal so that people can participate equally in a society. Second, you need equal social status with people in society. And so that is about recognition and respect for different identity groups. And third, you need representation in political decision-making. Now, Nancy Fraser's work is really interesting to chart through the sort of 2000s, because in the early 2000s, when she was writing, her work was about justices or social justice thought about in these two frames, basically what we call distributive justice, so wealth and access to resources, access to services, and identity politics, okay? So recognition and respect of identity groups. And then in the later 2000s, she added this third element, and there's a fantastic piece for anyone that's interested called Justice in a Globalized World. And because the question that came up for her time and time again is, who is represented in those first two? When we are talking about distributive justice, we're talking about identity politics and recognition. Who is represented in those discussions? And I mean, the simplest kind of example to give here is looking at nation states, right? So when we talk in a forum such as this, or when our politicians talk to us about you know, children in poverty and the need for children to have access to education and the need for children to have access to health services, really, who is represented in that conversation is usually, when it's a justice conversation in a nation, particularly in a government, it's usually Australian children that we're talking about. When we start talking about other children elsewhere, it becomes a conversation less about justice and more about charity. And so there's a sort of a conversation, and so you can see how this might play out when we're talking about rights of refugee groups and things like this. Who is represented in the conversations about those first two ideas about justice? Who gets the representation? And so they're the sort of three prongs with which we explored kind of, this is the sort of framework with which we began, I guess, our looking at the work and our looking when we asked the question, if this is an idea about social justice in our world, a parity of participation, what does drama do in this space? And so as neat as that sort of kind of those three ideas are. You know, when you think about what's involved in them, you think about competing discourses around power, access, agency, privilege, voice, and all of those things. It becomes quite a messy, but, you know, extremely dynamic space. Can I get the next slide, Michael? So, you know, basically the focus on how does this framework relate to drama is the entire book, right? So, but just to have kind of a few overview points on it. The focus on participation, when we look at how people talked about their drama work, and when we looked at examples of projects all around the world, and when we looked at theorizing and different sorts of sociological discussions that scholars were having in the applied theatre scene, participation was a massive part of it. Often the idea of embodied participation, the idea of being in a room participating in a process that was really, really central as that sort of first tenet of how does drama contribute in this space? How is it that being in a drama classroom or in a theatre workshop in a prison or in a community centre building drama and theatre work with a group, you know, participation was a core part of how we understood ourselves as doing good through this work, allowing for participation and actively participating together. Action was another one, an active contribution, people being able to tell stories, people being able to do work. And whether the conversation was about the rights for young people in schools to get up away from their desks and, you know, be in space with their bodies, or whether it was about the right for people to come together as communities, or whether it was about the right for people to have voice and have their stories heard. It was a very active space, and it was about the right for people to take action. And, you know, there's an interesting thing that a lot of the sort of critique around this work too is that it is, you know, temporary, you know, that these sorts of spaces that are built, these communities that we are actively building through drama work are temporary communities. But a lot of the work comes around to the idea that despite the fact that they're temporary, they're still powerful in what they offer people. So the sort of the action was there. The other thing to say is that when we looking at phrases, three kind of ideas about, or three aspects of a parody of participation. In drama work, most of the discussion, not all, but most of the discussion was really around that middle one. It was really around recognition. The idea that through drama, through the telling of stories, through the ability to express oneself, you can build respect in society for different groups. You can have people's ideas recognized by others, and the other way around too, where audiences, the importance of having people in the audience recognize themselves on stage, particularly groups that don't necessarily get a lot of representation on stage. The idea that it was important for people to see people like them respected and recognized and celebrated. And so the conversations about that and how drama fits into this space are very high level, but very much built around that idea of recognition and the ability for drama to help people understand others and build empathy for others through the telling of stories. And, you know, it's interesting, I was just saying before, I've been reading this really interesting work on the relationship between theatre and democracy. And this is one of the things that comes out again and again, the idea of deliberative democracy, sort of new radical deliberative democracy theories say it shouldn't be about, it shouldn't always be about argument. It's not about this side argues, okay? It actually, some of the really powerful kind of democratic work and democratic processes are actually about storytelling. People coming and telling stories about how a particular policy or a particular law impacts them to try and understand how we could do better. So taking away from that sort of adversarial view of politics. And so there's a big conversation about storytelling and narrative as central in that space. And I guess it's a good framework for critical exploration of the work, because similarly to sort of Bourdieu's ideas about capital, when we think about social capital and cultural capital and economic capital, one of the things that Bourdieu used to say is that they're all important, but really the cultural capital and social capital are supposed to convert eventually to some sort of economic capital as well. And so Fraser never goes so far as to say that, but there is an idea that actually they are supposed to be intertwined. It is supposed to be that if we are building respect and recognition for certain identity groups or people that often experience marginalization. That should then in turn, in time, convert itself into representation for those people in powerful spaces. It should also, you know, convert into some sort of distributive justice that sees those people more able to access wealth and resources and services in society. And so it does need to have, so we do have to ask a critical question there about our role. If our work is so heavy in recognition, is there a way for us to look at that work to see the impact beyond into the other two R's, if you want to call it Fraser's framework? Okay, thanks, Michael. Next slide would be great. So there's some of the high level ideas that kind of came out of our exploration. And like I say, it's the whole book trying to put that into 4 points, but just to start off with an idea of the sorts of things that we were looking at. So this is, these are the concepts that we based our chapters around. And it's interesting to go back and look at them now, you know, years and years ago when we sat down across, I think, your kitchen table in Limerick, Michael, and figured out what we thought they should be and why, based on a whole bunch of reading we'd done. It's interesting to see the ones, some of them are really understandable as themes discreetly, and some of them are, you know, are really, really intertwined. And the more I've read about them since, and the more research I've written about them since, even more and more intertwined in my head. You know, it's fun, like take democracy, for example. You know, so commonly it's connected to community, which is obviously in our localization and place chapter. And it's also really connected to education, because, you know, most great political scientists and politicians, you know, have always said that education is a core part of how people participate in democracy, that democracies don't work if you don't have an educated citizenry that are able to understand the things and vote and have their voice heard. You know, but then if I think about the work of Dewey, who, you know, as a teacher, Dewey is a theorist very close to my heart. And, you know, Dewey wrote an incredible essay, I think, in the mid-30s or mid-1930s or late 1930s, called Creative Democracy. And in that, Dewey talked about the need for democracy needed not only creativity, but inventiveness and cooperation. So it was, and his ideas about about democracy were very tied up in our ability as people to imagine a future and imagine consequences of different actions in the future. And then I was recently reminded of that essay because another essay written 60 years later that talks about that, and I think by someone called Richard Bernstein, and I think it's titled Creative Democracy, The Task Still Ahead. And I'd never read it before, but I found this fantastic quote, which, you know, speaks to, it's not a quote about drama, right? But as a drama teacher and as an applied theatre scholar, it is for me completely about drama, this quote. And so I'll just share it with you because it just shows you how so many of these ideas are intertwined. Bernstein says, Dewey recognized the importance of a commitment to ideals, to imaginative projections of a better future. But he never thought of ideas as divorced from reality. Just as he challenged the very idea that a means could be separated from the end, an ideal to which we are committed is not just a goal to be attained, it is a significance to be felt, appreciated. An ideal, like the democratic ideal, arises when the imagination idealizes existence by laying hold of the possibilities offered to thought and action. And there's so many things I love about that. One is you see this idea about action, right? That democracy and participation are active. But also you see, and as you see, that democracy then gets tied to the idea of the future. Okay, with Dewey, it's always really tied to the idea of youth too, which is there as well. Community, obviously, but creativity as well. You know, so there's a lot of kind of crossover, I think, in these ideas. And it's interesting, Michael and I chose to end the book with a chapter on beauty, love, and hope. And so much of what we read throughout it, that was where everybody ends. You know, that was the thing, is that we come to these we talk about, the scholarship in our field often speaks to very, very difficult topics, and it has quite critical conversations with itself about what it does and why, and its aims and its ideals, and often comes to a very hopeful place, which you know, I wasn't necessarily expecting when we started doing the research for the book. Okay, so they're the chapters, not the titles of the chapters, but they're the broadly conceived what the book was, and some of the core themes that went around it. What Michael and I thought we'd do in this is to now just spend about 20 minutes talking about two of those ideas, two of the chapters, basically, as examples. Now, one of the things we did in the book is in each of the chapters, we took 2 or 3 examples of theatre work that we found around the world. Now, some of it was theatre work that we knew really intimately. Some of it was work that we heard presented at conferences or that we knew people were doing. And some of it was work that we literally just found in our search and thought was interesting and really spoke to some of the things. So the extent to which we know the details of the projects that we're talking about as examples varied. But the point of the examples wasn't necessarily to give a detailed picture. It was more to have an illustration to hang a conversation off, I guess. And so one of the examples in the equity chapter is a program called Crossing Borders. And we found out about this program because I heard somebody speak about it at a conference, and I was really interested in it. And I then went to the program website at the time, it's a program that's done in New York with a homeless shelter in New York, but with academics from the Central School of Speech and Drama. And so I got downloaded reports on the project and had a look. And then about 2 or 3 months later, one of the critical friends on the project, Selena Busby, wrote an article about it. And so these were the sorts of things that framed my understanding of what the project was. But just to give you a very, very kind of brief rundown on what it was, so that we can have something to feed the discussion. It was a program that connected homeless youth and trafficked youth with Broadway stars in New York to build theatre work together. Okay, it was run from scholars of the Central School of Speech and Drama London, and according to their report, the goal of the project was to give youth the practical tools to cross the bridge into a new space, laying aside the mantle of being homeless, broken, abused, and abandoned. On a stage, in a script, they can choose a new narrative and tell the world who they are behind the homelessness. So that was their published goal. So the project itself brought together the established theatre artists with the homeless youth at the homeless shelter for a 4-week theatre devising process that culminated then in a theatre performance in an off-Broadway theatre. So it was interesting. One of the things that Selena Busby's paper, she reflects in her paper that once when she was there, a child asked if they needed a passport to travel beyond 34th Street, having never done so before. And so in a lot of ways, the young people's presence, the young homeless people's presence in a off-Broadway theatre, which is a really established cultural space, was something quite extraordinary. And so we looked at the reports and we thought a little bit about this and spoke to people about it and read these papers. And just like I say, this is not about the Crossing Bridges project necessarily, but it gives us a picture of an applied drama project, applied theatre project, that we can think about, well, how does this project and projects like it, because I could tell you, I say that, and I'm sure looking at the people that are in the room, most people in the room could think of projects that might have similar goals, that might have a similar sort of structure, that might run in similar sorts of ways. So projects like this, how can we look at a project like this and think about drama and equity? And so I guess the first thing that I'll say, and a lot of what I say hangs off this whole idea and comes into its recognition and redistribution, what actually was gained beyond the experience itself. And this isn't just my ideas, this was also some of the papers that I was reading and the reports that we're reading. We're bringing up this is what the scholars themselves were asking. We have provided this fantastic experience, which is a powerful thing. These people have been on stage in a cultural space that they would almost never have access to. So in some ways, we can talk about access to cultural spaces, which would give us a conversation about distribution in the sense of who gets to access the theatre, who gets to access these cultural spaces, and representation, okay? Who's allowed on this stage? Who's gets to be here, who gets represented by these spaces. But a lot of the work, and even from that one quote with the goal, you see is about recognition. It's about them being able to present a version of themselves that is alternative to the one that is seen by others, to be recognized differently, to be valued. And so there are a lot of questions there around, for me, around what is that critical relationship between those three R's and how's it at play here? One of the questions that came up in Selena Busby's paper is the extent to which there was genuine agency. This is, I think, a question we need to ask ourselves as theatre workers. In a moment, in this space, when people are participating and acting, you can see agency, you can see a sort of an agentive, active participation. But then the question becomes, if there's no systematic change beyond that, is there opportunities for agency afterwards? And so if these people want to become people that access cultural spaces, if we don't change the system after this one time when we let them, is there further, right? And this was one of the critical questions that was asked in some of the papers. This is not an idea about problematizing. You know, I was thinking about those old warm-up drama games, right? When you used to play yes and, right? My 10-year-old plays them all the time. She asks me to play it with her all the time. This is not a yes, but, okay? This isn't a yes, this is good work, but there are problems. This is a yes, there is good work, and there are other things to think about. This is a yes and game for us here, not a yes, but game. I just want to make that really clear. So one of the other things here is one of the other frameworks that I use in my teaching sometimes is Conrad Hughes' Understanding Prejudice in Education. And for anyone that works in education spaces, I would absolutely recommend it. It's one of those beautiful frameworks that makes things both more simple and more complex. And, you know, looking at reducing prejudice, one of the things that Conrad Hughes says is his number one in the framework is building an understanding beyond the other, without othering. Okay, so you can see that here really big. Okay, it's evident between, there's a youth artist thing where young people are getting to meet artists, established theatre artists, and they're getting to know, you know, different people that are different from themselves as people that are sharing experience, not as other. And similarly, artists are getting to meet youth and do that as well. And that builds greater understanding, it builds greater empathy, and it also builds a greater attention to the system that we're working in, I think, because when drama connects groups that are different from each other, particularly if one is experiencing some sort of marginalization that the other isn't, I think what it can do is get people to ask questions about a system. It can lead people to say, how can this happen to someone like me? Or how can this happen to someone I like, right? And so I think it can build that idea of getting people to think about how the system impacts unevenly, which understanding is, you could argue, the first step towards action. I think there's a cynical side to that as well, you know, as in the sense of success of a project like this or a project like that means that for people in poverty to see improved circumstances, people who aren't in poverty or people who are powerful have to think that it's a good idea. And so I do think that we can get into this sort of trap of, you know, in order for us to save or to do something about this or to work towards it or to question it or to use our power, we have to believe that it's worthwhile, that we have to think it's a good idea. And so I think that there's a sort of an interesting dynamic that happens there. One of the things that Selena asked in her one of the big goals of the research was the development of aspirational capital in the youth. You know, the idea that through this sort of a process, young people can see a version of themselves that is successful, that they can see a pathway to success, that they can start to build the sorts of self-esteem, confidence, skills needed in order to be able to find an alternative pathway for their lives if that's what they want. But Selena does ask quite a provocative question in her paper called Crossing Bridges, which is it aspirational? Is it aspirational capital, or is it cruel optimism that we're giving them? Because if the system isn't changing, you know, as much as they might want to do things, if it's still that much harder, if it's still that impossible systematically or systemically, then have we made as much a difference as we want? These are all really complex questions. You know, and I once had a wonderful conversation with Peter O'Connor, who would argue that a moment of beauty is, or a moment of joy or a moment of strength is worth it for itself. And I agree with that. You know, this is a hopeful conversation, but I do think these are really potent questions for us right now as a field. And just the last thing, I guess, to say is that one of the things that we talked about a lot in the equity chapter is the idea of voice and testimony, both as, you know, very celebrated central part of what we do. And as I was saying earlier, the idea of storytelling and narrative and expression in sort of a radical deliberative democracy is a sort of an emerging idea that is really, really powerful, I think. So voice and testimony is seen to be a great thing because it promotes recognition, it builds cultural respect, it allows us to bear witness, it allows us to bear witnesses to the lives of others. It recognizes that activism, Rose once said that it recognizes that activism exists in the territory of the everyday. And I love that idea, that by telling our stories, our own everyday existence can become a part of an activist movement. It can be a moment of activism. And also a lot of the discussion around voice and testimony is that it is a human right to have your voice heard, that it allows people to celebrate their stories. It allows people to celebrate each other. Somebody said it turns experiences into souvenirs. I love that idea too. And then, of course, on the other side of that, there are questions around voice and testimony that have come out. There is a concern that particularly the testimonies of marginalized and less powerful groups are often misused by those in more power. They are turned into sound bites to promote policy in the public realm. And then there's Danny Snyder-Young's idea that we must also be cautious of our own place in this and our own intentions for the project, because people's ideas and people's stories and people's views are not necessarily progressive, right? And so if we have a very strong progressive intention for our work, the extent to which we allow for personal voice and personal stories, and the extent to which we channel troublesome stories into safe waters, right? So that we can get the right kind of stories off our participants is something that we need to be really aware of.
Kel,
okay.
I'm going to jump in there. I'm just conscious of time.
Yes, I was just about to pass on to you, Michael.
Oh, fantastic. Excellent. Do you want to do that, or will I just keep going? I
think you should just keep going now. You've got the floor.
All right, fantastic. Well, I'm again, I do really want to leave a little space for conversation at the end of this. So I'm going to skip through the digital chapter in quite a cursory fashion. I probably won't probe it in as much depth, if I may, because some actually. This is a different treatment perhaps than Kelly has just offered of the equity chapter, and this chapter changed massively as we were writing it, because obviously the pandemic just changed utterly how we engage with the digital, from pedagogy to artistry to family life to worship to every single aspect of the human condition. All of a sudden became digitized. So that the chapter was called Digital Plus Drama to indicate the digital plus, the fact that there are myriad and perhaps infinite other digital realms that we have yet to discover. And really the challenge in this chapter was of locating drama within a space that has been profoundly impacted upon by the digital, the ramifications of digital technology. And what we tried to do was to avoid a kind of a deficit discourse around the digital, or indeed an overly optimistic discourse, because people tend to be either wildly pessimistic. Mobile phones are killing, not quite killing, but ruining children's lives, or the digital is a panacea to all. I think there's many universities in the world who think they might be able to sell off their campuses at huge profit in the years to come, because the digital will allow us to educate everyone. So, we try to avoid the kind of wild extremes of the kind of conversation that's there about the digital. And we use that, a priori notion of technoscapes. And to give you an idea of just the intersectionality of that idea, and I'm very aware that is a feminist word that I'm appropriating a little bit in terms of my discourse here. But, if you look at the National Theatre in London as an example of a kind of a technoscape, they have started NT Live. They've started streaming masses and masses of main stage productions, which really, obviously, during the pandemic became multiplied even more. And of course, one could argue that is characteristic of the technoscape, but it's really interesting to pull it apart and look at the other elements that are going on within that, because of course they wouldn't be able to do that without the HD technology and the bandwidth that allows for capture and then the distribution modes. So that's the changed mediascape allows for them to go on. But there's also a change in audience and a change perhaps in the makeup of the British culture and British public, people from different ethnic backgrounds and more diverse backgrounds wanting to access National Theatre productions. So there's a change in the ethnoscape. The NT Live, and of course this model has been replicated by theatres all over the world, including theatres with which I'm involved myself. But NT Live, of course, now has a significant revenue stream coming from their streaming. So that's a change in the finance-scape, as Appenjoy would call it. And then, of course, there is a social turn, as I referenced earlier, evident in the arts globally, which demands that there is much more accessibility and demands that there is availability of dramatic and theatrical engagement for publics all around the world. So that's a change in the ideoscape. So the technoscape has changed with regard to drama. I won't dwell terribly on social acceleration, but this is a really provocative, really interesting theory of Hartmut Rosa, German thinker, and he talks about the technical acceleration, the acceleration of, I suppose, literally the machinery, and the associated ideas of an acceleration of social change, because of course the machinery has changed, allowing us to change how it is we engage socially, but also an acceleration in the pace of life, which of course is something I think many of us on the call will have experienced, because we have access to, for example, work at all hours of the day and night. So in this chapter, and the digital and drama present two dialectics in really stark relief: the space between threat and opportunity, and the space then, of course, between presence and absence, liveness and the digital presence. And the chapter breaks that down then into four discussions: one around community, looking at Megan Alrutz's work in digital storytelling, then communication and pedagogy. We looked at the work of C&T, who are great friends of ours in the Midlands in the UK, and their new platform called Prospero. Kathleen Gallagher, again, who we referenced earlier on, but she and her team in Toronto have done some incredible multinational projects around identity and exploring identity using digital methodologies and research methodologies, which was really, really interesting. And then another artistry and the aesthetic engagement, Coney, who are a really interesting, immersive digital theatre company in the UK. If you haven't come across them, I recommend you have a look at them. So we looked at all of those things, but actually what I want to leave you with are some of the questions that arose from the engagement in this, because I find these really fascinating. And you can read them there for yourself. I think that the most provocative for me is probably the third one. Can drama play a part in deceleration and unitasking in the face of social acceleration and multitasking? And the one immediately after that is the power of drama as an educative force in its possibilities for connectivism, which is a concept borrowed from Siemens' work, rather than traditional philosophies of learning such as constructivism. And the post-truth one is a really, really interesting one. Can drama be an oasis of truth and discovery for participants in a post-truth world, which was the concept we threw about in that as well. So really, that was the essence of the digital chapter, but one that almost became like Mercury in some respects, because literally, I think writing that and writing the democracy chapter were really exciting and challenging at the same time, but they had to be updated every couple of weeks, because literally both concepts in the state of the world demanded that they were. And then where we've come to really, and I suppose, you know, Cal, do you want to chime in here again, really, and lead this one out? But I suppose this is really where we tried to lead the book after all of this critical engagement. We felt it was really important that those themes that Kelly brought through so beautiful earlier on of hope and possibility were really strong at the end of our conversation, because we really fervently believe in this work, and that critical engagement with it makes it stronger, not diminishes it in any way, shape or form. Kel?
Yeah, thanks. I just think it's, you know, it's a really potent intellectual space to work in, this sort of between critique and hope. But I found there's a great quote by Jan Cohen-Cruz and Mandy Schutzman, who wrote that immersion into critical thought keeps our practices adaptable and honest, as radical in practice as they are in theory, which I thought was a really nice sort of purpose for us as a field to continue this line of both celebrating and critiquing work and trying to understand it better. And yeah, the fact that so many of the papers that we read and so many of the projects and reports and things that we discussed ended with this idea of hope, right? This critical idea. And, you know, we draw on Freire's idea of hope, I guess, the idea that the world is unfinished. Not just that the world is unfinished, but we are part of the unfinished world, and therefore we're an agent in changing the unfinished world. And therefore we can see this unfinished world as a challenge, right? Rather than a limitation in our lives, which I just, you know, if you see hope, drama is at its core a hopeful activity. It is one of the take-home messages for me from this work, messy and complex and dynamic, but incredibly hopeful, which was, so that's, I think it's probably a nice place for us to finish and take questions.
All right, everyone. Thanks, Kelly and Michael. If you want to post questions, feel free to do so in the chat. Or put your avatar hand up. I've got a question which I'd like both of you to think about while other people are thinking up their questions. We often talk about and use this terminology, Kelly, and this is going to sound like I'm being pedantic. I'm not really, because I use this terminology myself, of, you know, we give to students this, or we give to communities that. I'm wondering if both of you could reflect, given the kind of work you've done in this fantastic book, and I really recommend people get a hold of it if they can, if they're at all interested.
Thanks for the plug,
drama. Yeah, that's okay. I was just being critical, so I thought I should plug it as well. That gift-giving kind of metaphor, I'm wondering whether you've got any thoughts about, you know, whether the work that you've done in this book has uncovered anything for you around that.
Short answer to that is yes. Heaps of thoughts. Yeah, look, this is actually something that I came to my attention a bit when I was writing with Sue Goodwin, who's a post-structuralist policy analyst, and she and I wondered whether or not we could do a sort of a post-structuralist policy analysis of a applied theatre report, which we did. And this was one of the things that came up for her really strongly, that I think I think I've become a bit immune to it working in the field. We do talk about the gift of theatre. We do talk about the gift of voice. We talk about these sorts of things. And but it was really, she found it very confronting, the idea that we would give people agency. And for her, there was it obviously speaks to a power relationship, right? Yeah, let me think more on that before, because I could go on for half an hour to try and get to my final point there. But I'm sure everybody else in the room is having thoughts about it too, or has had thoughts about it in the past. So maybe that's a good one to open up if anybody wants to contribute.
I might jump in.
Yeah, go on, Joe.
Oh, hello.
I saw you nodding before.
Joe?
I was looking at you.
No, I was just thinking about the idea of who's doing the giving of the gift. And, you know, as many of you know, I work a lot with people with disabilities in an inclusive community-based theatre. And the drama gift is what they're able to give when they present a performance. And for a person with a disability who's often in a position of being supported or helped, to be able to present a performance is a fantastic way of, feeling like they have something really significant to offer that makes people, happy. So the gift in that sense becomes the performance that they give.
Actually really like that, because it almost turns on its head a little bit, doesn't it? It is that community and that communal idea that we are all, by participating together and collaborating together, giving gifts, right? And so that's a nice thing, Jo, because I like that, because it speaks to that idea that we have privilege. We are privileged to hear these voices. We are privileged to have the opportunity to work in these spaces. And it talks to the gifts that we in the audience get from the participants. Yeah.
Yeah, and I realized in saying that, that it was a little bit othering because I was talking about them, because it truly is evolving into an inclusive theatre company, so that you don't know when you see a performance who has a disability and who doesn't, and we're all giving that gift together.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Any other comments on that or questions for Kelly or Michael?
There's a small question from Natalie in the chat.
Yes, I actually I'll write that into the chat while you guys talk amongst yourselves. I'll get that quote, I'll get that reference for you, Natalie.
I'm staying kind of quiet on that one, because I really have to think a little bit more about that notion of gift and where it works. It was actually a very good question, Michael, quite surprisingly.
You seem surprised.
Actually said surprisingly.
I did say surprisingly.
Okay, I'm going to kind of give my kind of call for last questions. We've got a rule on these webinars: if there's no questions to be had, we get an early night and get a drink. But I can see Paul Dwyer and Penny Bundy there. I can't believe they don't have questions.
Well, firstly, thank you to Kelly and Michael for, I've just downloaded the book actually from the library website while you've been talking. So there you go. Let's put that in your impact and engagement report on you.
Yeah. And your lack of royalties.
Yeah, well, that too. No, I don't have a question. Just a quick comment. I would have loved to, if we had more time, to talk more about how your reference to Pierre Bourdieu it works as part of your framework when you were discussing Nancy Fraser's work. But I'm on the notion of hope. One of the best things I've read in the last decade or so, really pithy, really short, Ghassan Haj, who is a Bourdieuian sociologist, obviously, he wrote a very tiny book called Searching for Hope in a Shrinking Society. I think that's the subtitle. The main title is Against Paranoid Nationalism. And so he was remarking on the way in which Australia had become a very mean society, in relation to the politics of people seeking asylum and refugee status and so forth. And he, as a Bourdieuian, he said, well, why don't we think of hope is also a kind of it's a product of society. Societies are, amongst other things, societies are mechanisms for distributing social hope. And like all other commodities, it's distributed unevenly. Like, having a continuing appointment at the uni as a lecturer, living in the inner west of Leichhardt, the home of the Prime Minister, I can have quite a lot of social hope, and I can invest energy into engagements with refugees and asylum seekers, as I do, but if I'm this, coming from a family that's suffered several generations of unemployment or underemployment, and maybe if I'm feeling hard done by, as a white Australian, but from an underprivileged social class, then I've got less capacity for social hope and a lot of anger. And that's anyway, that's his way of theorizing kind of the rise of Hansenism and so forth. And that's where, what does theatre do in those spaces? How does theatre engage with the young people in those communities? That's a big question. Too big for Monday. What are we, Thursday night?
Thursday, thankfully, not Monday. Yeah, thanks, Paul. That looks amazing. I actually just searched the book up then, so that will go on my reading list for sure. Sounds fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah, nice to see you, Paul, and thanks for that. That's really a really provocative question about the role that the drama theatre has, in order to combat the deficit, because of course those dialogues and those discourses have become more profound of disaffected nationalism, disaffected manisms, and how can drama theatre be an anecdote to that in some way, shape, or form? I think it's a really provocative question.
And it's a really interesting one for this sort of a project, because for this sort of a, I guess, intellectual project, because when we talk about the fact that a lot of the papers ended on a conversation of hopefulness and hope, a lot of that is about the practitioner themselves or the theorists themselves kind of trying to establish, feeling their hope, kind of you're seeing it reflected from them. And so that deeper question of, well, is hope like any other important social commodity or important personal sort of experience limited by this sort of systemic marginalization? Is what we call access to resources, is hope a resource there? I think that's a really provocative question.
May I ask in relation to that then, are you finding that the people that you yourself have worked with, or the people that you read about in projects like the one you mentioned with the Off-Broadway show, do the participants kind of self-select for hope?
Yeah.
Like, you don't show up unless you have a positive idea about what theatre might do.
Well, I think that could happen, but I think there's a lot of, sorry, Michael, I cut you off. There's a lot of instances, particularly as someone like me who works a lot in schools, of people being in the room because they don't have a choice.
Yeah. And it's funny when the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question, Anna, is actually the venue that's right behind me on this image. Because I have another life as a lighting designer, and we had funding a number of years ago to do work with a particularly disadvantaged community in Limerick City, to do a kind of a storytelling piece about their community. And we brought down a theatre company from Dublin called Theatre Club, and I was their lighting designer, so I wasn't involved as a researcher in any way, shape, or form. And they were involved because they wanted something to do in the evenings. It wasn't to do with hope. The people I spoke to just wanted to have a bit of fun. They knew there was going to be food, free food, if they were involved in the production. They knew that they were going to get a chance to be in the theatre. And I'm not saying the production wasn't hopeful. It was challenging in many respects, but I don't think hope was the driving force that brought them there. That's just my own personal experience. Yeah.
And as I'm thinking about that whole discussion, Paul, Michael and Kelly, I'm also thinking it is unevenly distributed, but it's also differentially displayed by people that you might think don't actually, aren't ingrained, don't have a good salary, etc., often demonstrate much more hope than other people that you would think have more allotted to them. So I think it's a kind of a fascinating knot to untie, and I think we do speak about it too uncritically often, actually.
Yeah.
And I'm as guilty of that as anybody.
Can I put my hand up to talk, or I'm not sure how I do that.
This is how you do it, Penny.
Okay, cool.
You're doing a great job.
First of all, can I say thank you? I found the discussion and the questions you raised for me so stimulating, so engaging. So thank you both. Really fabulous. And I think that's what I want to respond to. That I suppose that the kind of contexts that I worked in were with challenging participants, challenging contexts where nobody wanted to help the people, nobody wanted to participate in anything, but they needed the kinds of things you're talking about senses of connection and all sorts of things. So people who know me know the work I've worked in. What I found in your PowerPoints, Kelly, particularly, every dot point you had for me was an article, a question and a kind of, let's have a conversation just about this dot point for about at least 5 or 6 of them. So I thank you so much. I was so engaged by the ideas you two are exploring. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Penny. Thank you.
Thanks, Penny.
I think we found the same thing, and that's why the conversation has taken us 10 years, and also why that we nearly ran aground a few times trying to finish the book, Penny, because we discovered that ourselves, that we got into these incredibly intricate and multi-layered and transdisciplinary conversations with regard to issues like hope, like agency, like democracy, like sex, myriad issues.
Whose voice? Hey. Yeah.
Look, and it became incredibly tricky, and that's coming from as well, the perspective of 2 white global north, permanently employed university lecturers who have lots of privilege in their own right as well, and trying to check that and remember that our perspectives are not always particularly, by very nature, the correct one. Sorry, Kel, I know you wanted to go in there.
No, well, totally. And I think that just picking up on what you were saying then, Michael, and it's, I kind of feel the same way still, Penny. Like I kind of go, I could write and all of these discussions that are coming out around, now I've got different ways of thinking about hope because of this thing that we're talking about.
Michael, I didn't mean a yes, no kind of answer. I was talking about the complexities that you could dig into on each, as you're saying, Kelly,
But I think that's one of the things is that there became a really hard time at some point in the writing where we went, these ideas are constantly evolving, and the more we think about them, the more there are, and they're all much bigger than we thought they were. And at some point, we're going to have to publish this thing.
Yeah,
and
which
say,
is why I never write
anything in the conversation. This is the point in the conversation now. But we, I certainly, and I'm speak for Michael here because I know him too well potentially, but I think we see this as a conversation with the field. It's not a discrete project even, it's just a moment that is an ongoing conversation with the field. I mean, it was born out of our edited book that you have a paper on emotion, and that Kathleen, and it was born out of that conversation and kind of has just emerged. And now I'm sitting here going, I want to unpack that idea about the gift and the discourses around the way we gift and who gives gifts and what are the gifts of theatre. And I mean, it's so...
My comment was to congratulate you both, not to challenge you. I was saying...
No, and it's taken very much in that light, Penny. Thank you. It means a lot coming from you. And it's, I think it's more. I think our reactions are more indicative of kind of the genuine intellectual kind of excitement and dissonance that these conversations cause within us. We've been thrown over and back, and I think we'll continue to be when we recover from this one and we figure out what we talk next about. But
great,
that's
great stuff.
And it's just struck me. I think when Helen Nicholson wrote her book on applied drama, I think the subtitle is about the gift.
Yeah,
the
gift of theatre. The gift of theatre.
But she really troubled over the title and the notion of gift, as she does in the book itself, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions or comments?
Just thank you. I'm looking forward to getting the book. Wonderful.
You can download it for free, apparently. Paul Dwyer's just managed it, so that's excellent.
Library.
What?
From the library.
Please do.
Dead right. Yeah,
how do we read it for free?
We're going to get rich on the royalties otherwise, right?
The library should have it, Penny.
Okay. Griffith.
Probably. Well, I don't know if Griffith. Sydney Griffith. There you go, Nat. Thank you. Griffith
Thank you, Nat. Brilliant.
All right. Before we lose them too much money, we might wind up. Robin, did you want to give us any last thoughts before we wind up for the evening?
Well, I was just going to also say, I thought those questions that you asked about drama itself, you know, is drama now a sanctuary of stillness and place for de-rolling, etc.? I think all of those questions deserve conversations.
Yeah, that's what I was saying, Robin. You know,
Yeah.
like it was every one of those points. Yeah.
Yeah. And if we think about the neuroscientific research, you know, that is also coming out about the importance of stillness, the myth of multitasking, and the need for us to stop and listen, etc. You know, I think there's, and each one of those questions, you know, can't be glossed over. And I think it's really important for us to find a way to have, you know, some really important conversations about those things. Perhaps we can think about how we could do that, Michael.
Anyway.
Sounds
great, Robin.
But thank you both so much for that, you know, incredible challenge and those provocations. Just brilliant.
Thanks, Robin.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you, everyone.
Yep.
So nice to see everyone.
Yeah,
Yes.
really nice. Thanks, Michael. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Anna, for making this all possible. And keep an eye on the e-news. There'll be something spectacular in a few weeks' time. So thanks so much for your time, everyone. Hope to see you all again soon sometime.